The flight of chance. The first-class cabin of an evening flight from Los Angeles to New York was calm, quiet, and filled with that faint hum that only long-distance travelers know. Soft lighting glowed overhead, attendants moved gracefully, and passengers settled into their wide leather seats with newspapers, books, and champagne. Among them, sitting quietly near the window in the second row, was a man most of the world would instantly recognize, but here, in this hushed sanctuary above the clouds, he seemed to blend into the background. Keanu Reeves had boarded without ceremony, dressed simply in dark jeans, a faded gray jacket, and his well-worn boots. No entourage, no spotlight, just Keanu carrying nothing more than a backpack and a paperback novel. To anyone paying attention, it would have been strange to see one of the world's most famous actors, a man whose face had been plastered across billboards and movie posters for decades, behaving like an ordinary traveler. But that was Keanu, known not only for his roles in blockbuster films but also for his humility. He never demanded special treatment. He never insisted on red carpets where none were laid, but humility often goes unnoticed, and sometimes it even invites unkindness. The man in the aisle seat 2 seats over from Keanu. In the aisle seat sat another passenger, a man named Gregory Stanton. Gregory was in his mid-40s, wearing a sharply tailored suit that screamed of expensive taste. His cufflinks gleamed under the cabin lights, and his gold wristwatch caught the eye every time he adjusted his sleeve. Gregory was the kind of person who believed the world owed him recognition. He had built a successful real estate company, and though his empire was not nearly as vast as he liked to pretend, he carried himself as if he were a titan of industry. Gregory loved to be seen, loved to be heard, loved to be respected. And when respect wasn't freely given, he demanded it. So when Gregory first noticed the man sitting quietly beside him, long hair, scruffy beard, and almost unremarkable presence, he didn't recognize Keanu. At least, not right away. Gregory leaned back in his seat, flagged down a flight attendant, and ordered a glass of the most expensive wine on the menu. His voice carried loudly, disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the cabin. A few passengers glanced his way, mildly annoyed, but Gregory didn't notice or didn't care. When the attendant returned with his drink, Gregory lifted the glass, sniffed it with theatrical flair, and muttered something about how it wasn't quite up to the standards of his personal cellar. Then, turning slightly, his eyes fell on Keanu's plain appearance, and that was when the sneer began. The first insult. "Funny," Gregory said loudly enough for those around to hear. "You'd think in first class people would at least dress the part." Keanu didn't look up. He was focused on the book in his hands, a biography of a scientist whose name most people wouldn't even know. His fingers turned the page slowly, calmly. Gregory, unsatisfied with being ignored, smirked and pressed further. "I mean, look at this guy. Jeans, old boots, some thrift store jacket. First class isn't coach, buddy. Maybe you're on the wrong side of the curtain." A couple of nearby passengers glanced nervously in Keanu's direction, then back at Gregory, silently willing him to stop. But Gregory had found his audience, and nothing fueled him more than attention. Still, Keanu remained quiet. His eyes traced the lines of text, his posture unchanged. And for Gregory, that silence was an open invitation. Words in the sky. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane reached cruising altitude. Soft chimes signaled that passengers were free to move about, and attendants began offering meals. The scent of roasted chicken and warm bread drifted through the first-class section. Most passengers leaned back, adjusting their seats into recline, ready for a long flight. But for Gregory Stanton, relaxation was never the goal. He thrived on making himself the center of gravity wherever he went. And now, with an audience confined at 35,000 feet, he found fertile ground for his arrogance. Keanu Reeves remained in his seat, quiet, eyes moving steadily over his book. His posture radiated calmness, as if the chaos around him couldn't touch him, but his silence seemed to irritate Gregory even more. "Hey," Gregory said suddenly, tapping the armrest near Keanu. "You ever flown first class before?" Keanu looked up briefly, his dark eyes warm but steady. He nodded once, polite, without a word, before returning to his page. Gregory chuckled. "Thought so. You look like one of those guys who saves up for years just to buy a ticket like this. Big splurge, huh?" A woman sitting across the aisle, elegantly dressed and with the air of someone used to first-class travel, frowned at Gregory's tone. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but Keanu's composure, his unshakable calm, stopped her. There was no anger in him, no defensiveness, no need to win the exchange. Gregory, however, took the silence as permission. You know, he continued, swirling the wine in his glass, there's a reason they separate Coach from us. It's not just about comfort, it's about class. People like us, he gestured to his suit, his watch. We work hard, we earn this. Then someone shows up in beat-up jeans and suddenly it cheapens the whole atmosphere. Don't you think? Keanu closed his book slowly, resting it on his lap. His expression was neutral, unreadable, but his eyes met Gregory's with a patience that unsettled the man more than open confrontation ever could. I think, Keanu said softly, his voice low and even, that being here doesn't make anyone more or less than anyone else? Gregory laughed, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. That's exactly what someone who doesn't belong here would say. Several passengers exchanged looks now. A businessman 2 rows ahead shook his head slightly, as if embarrassed to be in the same cabin as Gregory. The woman across the aisle leaned forward, her eyes flashing with irritation. But Keanu remained calm, as though the words had rolled off him like water on stone. A whispered recognition. The flight attendant, a young man named Daniel, approached to offer Keanu a meal. His eyes widened for just a split second, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, but he remained professional. He set the tray down gently, murmuring, "Would you like the vegetarian option, sir?" Keanu smiled faintly, grateful. "Yes, thank you." Gregory noticed the exchange. "You act like you're some kind of big shot," he scoffed. "But I've never seen you in my life. I know important people, believe me. If you were anyone, I'd know." Daniel's hands paused on the tray for the briefest moment. He glanced at Keanu, who gave him a small reassuring nod as if to say, "It's fine, don't worry." Then Daniel moved on, unwilling to feed Gregory's ignorance. But now a quiet ripple of curiosity moved through the cabin. A few passengers began whispering, recognizing Keanu's familiar features. The beard, the hair, the gentle presence. They knew, but Keanu himself clearly wasn't interested in correcting Gregory. Gregory Double's down dinner service ended. Plates were cleared, lights dimmed to allow passengers to rest. But Gregory, fueled by a combination of ego and expensive wine, wasn't done. "You know what separates winners from losers?" he said suddenly, leaning closer to Keanu. "It's not luck. It's not some sob story. It's dominance. It's knowing your worth and making others know it too. Guys like you fade into the background. You'll never matter because you don't demand to matter." For the first time, Keanu set his book aside completely. He folded his hands on the armrest, turned toward Gregory, and spoke with quiet clarity. "Maybe," Keanu said, "it isn't about demanding to matter. Maybe it's about doing good where you can, helping when no one asks you to, living in a way that means something to someone else even if the world never notices." Gregory scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Sounds like loser talk to me. That kind of thinking doesn't build empires." But several passengers heard Keanu's words, and they lingered in the air like something heavy, something undeniable. The woman across the aisle gave Keanu a grateful smile, as if he had spoken for everyone who'd endured Gregory's arrogance silently. Gregory, however, saw none of it. He only saw himself reflected in his glass of wine, convinced of his superiority. What he didn't know was that by the time this flight landed, his certainty would shatter. Cracks in the armor. The cabin had quieted now. Most passengers reclined in their seats, some already asleep, others lost in the glow of tablets or books. The gentle hiss of the ventilation system and the steady rumble of the engines created a white noise that lulled the restless into stillness. But Gregory Stanton was wide awake. His glass of wine sat half empty on the tray in front of him, and his mind, though clouded, refused to slow down. He glanced sideways at Keanu, who sat with his eyes closed, not asleep, but resting with the ease of someone who carried no burden of proving himself to the world. That was what bothered Gregory most. Not the jeans, not the boots, not the book. It was the calm. The peace. Gregory could spot it because he had never known it. Gregory's reflection. Gregory shifted in his seat, the leather creaking. His thoughts drifted unwillingly backward, to his childhood in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Queens. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a seamstress. Money was always scarce, and arguments about bills filled the air like smoke. Gregory remembered vowing as a boy that he would never live that way. He would never be small, never be unseen. He worked hard, yes, harder than most, and clawed his way up the real estate ladder. But with every deal closed, with every new car or suit, the hole inside him only grew larger. He didn't want to remember that now. Not on a flight where appearances meant everything. So he drowned the memory with another sip of wine and turned again toward Keanu, who, infuriatingly, seemed untouched by the weight of proving himself. Must be nice, Gregory muttered, almost to himself, to not care what people think. Keanu opened his eyes slowly, looking at him, not judgmentally, not with pity, but with a kind of gentle curiosity. "It is nice," he said softly, "but it took me a long time to learn how." Gregory barked a short laugh. "Yeah? What, you went to some meditation retreat or something?" Keanu shook his head. "Life teaches you, if you listen." The simplicity of the answer made Gregory feel strangely uneasy, so he quickly looked away. A sudden disturbance. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some turbulence ahead. Please fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." Almost on cue, the plane jolted, sending a ripple of nervous energy through the passengers. Cups rattled, overhead bins groaned, and someone let out a sharp gasp. Gregory gripped the armrests tightly, his knuckles white. He hated turbulence. It reminded him that no matter how much money he had, no matter how powerful he thought himself to be, he was still at the mercy of forces far beyond his control. Beside him, Keanu calmly fastened his seatbelt and closed his book. When the plane shuddered again, he glanced around, checking on the other passengers instead of himself. He noticed the elderly couple 2 rows back holding hands tightly. A young mother trying to calm her crying toddler. Even Daniel, the flight attendant whose professional smile couldn't quite hide the tension in his jaw. And then there was Gregory, breathing fast, his chest heaving with shallow gulps of air. "You okay?" Keanu asked gently. Gregory forced a scoff, though his voice wavered. "Fine, just hate when the pilots hit bumps like this. Makes you wonder if they know what they're doing." Keanu's lips curved in the faintest smile. "They know. Planes are built for this. More than we are." Another jolt rocked the cabin, and Gregory flinched visibly. This time Keanu rested a calm hand on the armrest between them, not touching Gregory but close enough to ground the moment. "Breathe," Keanu said quietly. "Slow. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. Works better than wine." Gregory shot him a glare, but to his own surprise, he followed the advice. Slowly, awkwardly, and little by little, his heart rate began to settle. The observing passengers, several passengers had noticed the exchange. The woman across the aisle who had earlier frowned at Gregory's rudeness, now watched Keanu with open admiration. The businessman ahead leaned back slightly, his respect clear. Even Daniel, passing through to double-check seatbelts, paused for a heartbeat at the sight. Keanu Reeves, the movie star, not acting, not playing a role, but simply being who he was. Kind, steady human. Gregory, however, wasn't ready to surrender his pride. As soon as the turbulence smoothed out, he cleared his throat and said, "Thanks, I guess. But don't think this makes us friends or anything." Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Friendship doesn't work that way. It's not about what you declare. It's about what you do." The words landed heavier than Gregory expected. He turned away, staring into the darkness outside the window. His reflection looked back at him, but for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he liked what he saw. The unexpected lesson, the turbulence faded, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Something invisible had cracked, not in the plane, but in Gregory Stanton. For the first time in years, he had followed someone else's lead, and worse, it had worked. Now he sat in silence, his pride wrestling with the unfamiliar sensation of relief. His instinct screamed to reassert control, to put walls back up, but his chest still felt looser, his breathing calmer, and he hated that he owed that to a man he had mocked. A quiet gesture. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, offering hot towels and checking on passengers. Daniel paused again at Keanu's row. "Everything all right here, gentlemen?" he asked, eyes flicking subtly to Gregory. Keanu smiled and nodded. "We're good. Thank you." Gregory opened his mouth to deliver a snide remark, but before he could, Keanu added softly, "You're doing a great job." I know flights like this aren't easy. Daniel blinked, momentarily stunned. Compliments in first class usually came wrapped in entitlement or condescension. Rarely were they simple, sincere. His smile grew genuine. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. As Daniel walked on, Gregory muttered, What was that about? He's just doing his job. Keanu turned to him with a faint shrug. So are you in real estate. Does it mean you don't deserve to be seen, appreciated? Gregory shifted uncomfortably. He had never thought of it that way. To him, gratitude was for the weak. Recognition was demanded, not given freely. The story of a stranger hours passed. The cabin dimmed further, night swallowing the sky outside. Many passengers slept, but Keanu remained awake, gazing at the stars beyond the window. Gregory, unable to fully rest, leaned back and sighed. You always talk like some wise monk, Gregory said quietly, careful not to wake those around them. Where's that even come from? You some kind of preacher? Keanu chuckled. No, just someone who's lived, made mistakes, lost people, learned from it. Something in his tone carried weight, more than words. Gregory frowned. Lost people? Keanu nodded, eyes still on the stars. Too many. Friends, family, people I loved. Life has a way of reminding you that nothing lasts forever. Not money, not fame, not even health. The only thing you can hold on to is how you treat people, and how they remember you when you're gone. Gregory shifted again, this time more unsettled than before. He thought of his own life, of the employees he barked at, the partners he discarded, the son he barely called, the wife who had left him years ago with the words, I don't even know who you are anymore. He swallowed hard. That's depressing. Keanu shook his head. It's not if you let it teach you. Losing people hurts, but it also reminds you how precious it is to have anyone at all. Every kindness you give out, every moment of compassion, you don't know how much it might mean to someone who needs it. Gregory scoffed lightly, but his voice was thinner now. Compassion doesn't pay the bills. No, Keanu said softly, but it pays the soul. A mid-flight scare. As if to punctuate his words, a call button chimed a few rows back. The elderly man who had earlier gripped his wife's hand was now slumped forward, his chest rising unevenly. His wife cried out, panic filling her voice. Help, please, he can't breathe. The cabin stirred immediately. Passengers sat up, alarm spreading like wildfire. Daniel and another attendant rushed to the couple's side, trying to calm the woman while checking the man's vitals. Is there a doctor on board? Daniel called out, his voice carrying urgency. For a moment, silence reigned. Then a woman from economy hurried forward, identifying herself as a nurse. She knelt quickly beside the man, assessing him. But her expression was tense. He needs oxygen, now. The attendant scrambled to bring the emergency kit. The wife wept, clutching her husband's hand. The entire cabin was alive with tension, fear buzzing in the air. Gregory froze. His mind screamed at him to look away, to not get involved. This wasn't his problem. He had spent his life avoiding other people's problems unless they benefited him. But Keanu was already on his feet. He moved quickly, not hesitating, kneeling beside the woman. He didn't try to take over or pretend to know more than the nurse. Instead, he placed a steady hand on the woman's shoulder and spoke softly. He's not alone. You're not alone. We're here. His calmness, his quiet certainty spread like warmth in the icy moment. The woman, though still terrified, nodded shakily as if borrowing his strength. Gregory watched, stunned. He had mocked this man for hours, dismissed him as weak, irrelevant. Yet here he was, the only one steady enough to ground a stranger's pain. A lesson without words. The nurse and attendants managed to stabilize the elderly man with oxygen. Slowly his breathing evened out, and the worst of the crisis passed. The cabin exhaled as one, relief sweeping like a tide. The wife clutched Keanu's hand now, tears streaming. Thank you, she whispered. You didn't have to. Keanu shook his head gently. We all have to when we can. Then he quietly returned to his seat as though nothing extraordinary had happened. No demand for recognition. No need for applause, but Gregory couldn't look away. For the first time in years, his chest ached with something unfamiliar. Shame. The weight of silence. The cabin gradually settled after the scare, but something had shifted in the air. Gratitude lingered. Respect lingered. Even awe. Passengers who had once tried not to stare at Keanu now looked at him openly, though discreetly. as if acknowledging without words what they had just seen. The elderly woman still clung to her husband's hand, occasionally glancing at Keanu with tears of thanks. The nurse from economy gave him a nod of respect before returning to her seat. Keanu, as always, seemed untouched by the attention. He leaned back in his seat, reopened his book, and slipped once more into quiet presence as though nothing unusual had happened. But Gregory couldn't shake it. His mind was a storm, his chest tight, the mirror of shame. Gregory had spent years building walls around himself. Walls of wealth, of status, of control. He had convinced himself that those walls made him untouchable, that nothing could expose the boy from Queens who had grown up with empty cupboards and hand-me-down shoes. Yet, in one act of simple kindness, Keanu Reeves had pierced through every layer. Gregory stared at the man beside him. "Why?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, harsh, almost accusatory. Keanu looked up. "Why what? Why'd you do that? Get involved? It wasn't your problem." Keanu closed the book gently, marking his page. "Because it was someone's pain. And if I can help even a little, then it becomes my problem too." Gregory shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. You don't even know them." "That's exactly why," Keanu replied softly. "Strangers need kindness most of all." The words hit like a hammer against Gregory's armor. He wanted to laugh, to dismiss them as sentimental nonsense, but instead he found himself turning toward the dark window, seeing only his own reflection, a man with everything money could buy, but none of the peace sitting quietly beside him. A conversation in the dark hours passed. The cabin was quiet, most passengers asleep. Gregory sat restless, unable to escape his thoughts. Finally he muttered, "You really believe all that? About kindness and compassion?" Keanu nodded. "I do. Even after everything? You said you lost people. Doesn't that make you angry, bitter?" For the first time, Keanu's eyes seemed to grow distant, shadowed with memories. It did for a long time. But anger doesn't heal anything. It doesn't bring people back. All it does is poison you until you've lost yourself too. Gregory swallowed hard. "So what healed you?" Keanu leaned back, considering. His voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "People. The ones who showed me love when I didn't deserve it. The ones who reminded me I still had something to give, and the choice to stop living only for myself." Gregory laughed bitterly. "Living for yourself is the only way you survive in this world." "Survive, maybe," Keanu said gently, "but not live." The silence that followed was heavier than any turbulence. Gregory felt the words pressing against the walls he had spent decades building. For the first time, he wasn't sure those walls would hold a flicker of change. As the night deepened, the woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, catching Gregory's eye. She gave him a look, not unkind but pointed. A look that said, "Do you see now? Do you understand who you've been mocking all this time?" Gregory shifted uncomfortably, heat rising in his chest. He wasn't used to being the one judged, and yet in this moment he knew he deserved it. But Keanu seemed unaware or uninterested in the subtle shift of social currents around him. He simply returned to his book, offering Gregory no condemnation, no scorn, no triumph. Only space, and somehow that was worse. Gregory wanted to be hated, wanted to be fought, wanted to be given an excuse to double down on his arrogance. But Keanu gave him nothing but patience. And in that silence, Gregory was forced to face himself. A restless heart sleep refused to come. Gregory lay back, eyes closed, but memories surged. His father shouting, his mother crying, his first big deal, the rush of power, his first million, the thrill of triumph, the wife who had once looked at him with love, then later with disappointment, the son who had stopped calling. He had everything he thought he wanted, and yet, sitting beside this man in worn jeans and scuffed boots, he had never felt poorer. Finally, in the darkness, Gregory whispered words he hadn't spoken in years, maybe ever. "I don't know how to be that, the way you are." Keanu turned his head, his eyes kind even in the dim light. "You don't have to be me. You just have to be honest. Start small, start real." Gregory said nothing more, but for the first time in years his heart ached, not with pride, not with hunger, but with longing. The beginning of change. Morning light crept through the cabin windows as the plane approached the East Coast. The long night was over, but Gregory felt as though he had lived a lifetime in those hours. He was exhausted, not from lack of sleep, but from wrestling with himself. The old version of Gregory, the brash, arrogant, self-satisfied mogul, was still there, clinging to pride like a lifeline. But something softer had taken root. Something quieter. Something that whispered, "You don't have to live this way anymore." The struggling mother's breakfast trays were served. A small commotion stirred an economy. A young mother, no more than 25, was struggling with her toddler. The child screamed, face red with frustration, while the mother, frazzled and embarrassed, tried desperately to calm him. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some sighing audibly, others shooting her annoyed looks. Gregory noticed it first. His instinct was to scoff, "Control your kid," the same way he always did when people disrupted his carefully controlled world. But then he glanced at Keanu, who was watching the scene with quiet empathy. Keanu didn't frown, didn't judge. Instead, he reached into his backpack, pulled out a small toy car, worn, clearly used, and handed it discreetly to Daniel, the flight attendant. "Could you give this to the little one?" Keanu asked softly. Daniel's eyes widened. "Of course." Within minutes, the crying toddler had the toy in his small hands. His sobs quieted into sniffles, then into curiosity, and finally into laughter. The young mother's eyes filled with tears as she mouthed, "Thank you," toward the first-class cabin. The tension evaporated. Economy passengers smiled. Even those who had been annoyed now softened. Gregory sat frozen. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. Keanu Reeves, an international star, carrying a used toy car in his bag, ready to give it away to a stranger's child. "You carry toys?" Gregory asked, disbelief in his voice. Keanu smiled faintly. "Sometimes. Kids get restless. A small gesture can make a flight easier, for them and for everyone around." Gregory stared at him. "That's crazy. You don't even know them." "That's the point," Keanu said gently. A test for Gregory. Moments later, Daniel returned, leaning down toward Gregory. "Excuse me, sir," he whispered. "That mother's asking if there's any chance she could get a little extra milk for her child. We're low, but I thought I'd ask." Gregory opened his mouth, ready to dismiss it. "Not my problem." But something stopped him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of a choice. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he said, "Bring her my milk." "I don't need it." Daniel blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" Gregory hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." When Daniel carried the milk back to the young mother, she looked toward Gregory with eyes full of gratitude. She mouthed, "Thank you," and Gregory felt something strange bloom in his chest. Not pride, not superiority, but warmth. For the first time in years, he had done something for someone who could give him nothing in return. And it felt good, a quiet affirmation Keanu noticed. Of course he did. He said nothing at first, allowing Gregory to sit in the quiet strangeness of his own choice. Then after a while, he leaned slightly toward him and said, "That was kind." Gregory frowned. "It was just milk," Keanu shook his head. "It's never just anything. Every kindness is bigger than it looks." Gregory stared at him, unsure how to respond, but inside something cracked further. The walls he had built for decades were crumbling, and he wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild them. The final conversation as the plane began its descent. Keanu closed his book one last time. He looked out the window, the skyline of New York faint in the distance, then turned back to Gregory. "You know," Keanu said, "people remember money for a little while. They remember power for even less. But they remember kindness for a lifetime." Gregory swallowed hard, his throat tight. "And what if I've spent my life getting it wrong?" Keanu smiled gently. "Then today is the perfect day to start getting it right." The words lingered, heavy and liberating all at once. Gregory felt tears sting his eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself since boyhood. He looked down, ashamed, but Keanu didn't look away. Instead, Keanu offered a simple nod as though giving permission. Permission to forgive. Permission to begin again. The beginning of change. Morning light crept through the cabin windows as the plane approached the East Coast. The long night was over, but Gregory felt as though he had lived a lifetime in those hours. He was exhausted, not from lack of sleep, but from wrestling with himself. The old version of Gregory, the brash, arrogant, self-satisfied mogul, was still there, clinging to pride like a lifeline. But something softer had taken root. Something quieter. Something that whispered, "You don't have to live this way anymore." The struggling mother's breakfast trays were served. A small commotion stirred an economy. A young mother, no more than 25, was struggling with her toddler. The child screamed, face red with frustration, while the mother, frazzled and embarrassed, tried desperately to calm him. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some sighing audibly, others shooting her annoyed looks. Gregory noticed it first. His instinct was to scoff, control your kid, the same way he always did when people disrupted his carefully controlled world. But then he glanced at Keanu, who was watching the scene with quiet empathy. Keanu didn't frown, didn't judge. Instead, he reached into his backpack, pulled out a small toy car, worn, clearly used, and handed it discreetly to Daniel, the flight attendant. "Could you give this to the little one?" Keanu asked softly. Daniel's eyes widened. "Of course." Within minutes, the crying toddler had the toy in his small hands. His sobs quieted into sniffles, then into curiosity, and finally into laughter. The young mother's eyes filled with tears as she mouthed, "Thank you," toward the first-class cabin. The tension evaporated. Economy passengers smiled. Even those who had been annoyed now softened. Gregory sat frozen. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. Keanu Reeves, an international star, carrying a used toy car in his bag, ready to give it away to a stranger's child. "You carry toys?" Gregory asked, disbelief in his voice. Keanu smiled faintly. "Sometimes. Kids get restless. A small gesture can make a flight easier, for them and for everyone around." Gregory stared at him. "That's someone crazy. You don't even know them." "That's the point," Keanu said gently. A test for Gregory. Moments later, Daniel returned, leaning down toward Gregory. "Excuse me, sir," he whispered. "That mother's asking if there's any chance she could get a little extra milk for her child. We're low, but I thought I'd ask." Gregory opened his mouth, ready to dismiss it. "Not my problem." But something stopped him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of a choice. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he said, "Bring her my milk." "I don't need it." Daniel blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" Gregory hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." When Daniel carried the milk back to the young mother, she looked toward Gregory with eyes full of gratitude. She mouthed, "Thank you," and Gregory felt something strange bloom in his chest. Not pride, not superiority, but warmth. For the first time in years, he had done something for someone who could give him nothing in return. And it felt good, a quiet affirmation Keanu noticed. Of course he did. He said nothing at first, allowing Gregory to sit in the quiet strangeness of his own choice. Then after a while, he leaned slightly toward him and said, "That was kind." Gregory frowned. "It was just milk," Keanu shook his head. "It's never just anything. Every kindness is bigger than it looks." Gregory stared at him, unsure how to respond, but inside something cracked further. The walls he had built for decades were crumbling, and he wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild them. The final conversation, as the plane began its descent, Keanu closed his book one last time. He looked out the window, the skyline of New York faint in the distance, then turned back to Gregory. "You know," Keanu said, "people remember money for a little while. They remember power for even less. But they remember kindness for a lifetime." Gregory swallowed hard, his throat tight. "And what if I've spent my life getting it wrong?" Keanu smiled gently. "Then today is the perfect day to start getting it right." The words lingered, heavy and liberating all at once. Gregory felt tears sting his eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself since boyhood. He looked down, ashamed, but Keanu didn't look away. Instead, Keanu offered a simple nod as though giving permission. Permission to forgive. Permission to begin again. The beginning of change. Morning light crept through the cabin windows as the plane approached the East Coast. The long night was over, but Gregory felt as though he had lived a lifetime in those hours. He was exhausted, not from lack of sleep, but from wrestling with himself. The old version of Gregory, the brash, arrogant, self-satisfied mogul, was still there, clinging to pride like a lifeline. But something softer had taken root, something quieter, something that whispered, "You don't have to live this way anymore." The struggling mother's breakfast trays were served. A small commotion stirred an economy. A young mother, no more than 25, was struggling with her toddler. The child screamed, face red with frustration, while the mother, frazzled and embarrassed, tried desperately to calm him. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some sighing audibly, others shooting her annoyed looks. Gregory noticed it first. His instinct was to scoff, control your kid, the same way he always did when people disrupted his carefully controlled world. But then he glanced at Keanu, who was watch. The landing of truth, the announcement came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into New York. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. The cabin stirred with life again. Shades lifted, light poured in, and the sprawling city came into view. For most, it was just another landing. For Gregory Stanton, it felt like the end of one life and the fragile beginning of another, the silence before goodbye. Gregory sat back in his seat, staring at the skyline. His mind was full, heavier than any luggage in the overhead bins. For years, he had defined himself by what he owned, what he controlled, what he demanded. But in a single flight, sitting beside a man in worn boots and jeans, his entire definition of success had been rewritten. The silence between him and Keanu was no longer uncomfortable. It was steady, restful, the kind of silence that says, you don't have to fill this. You can just be. Finally, Gregory spoke. You know, I'm not used to being wrong, but I think I've been wrong about a lot. Keanu gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. That's the start of wisdom. The passengers goodbye. When the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. The young mother with the toddler paused at the front of the cabin. She leaned toward Keanu and whispered, "Thank you again. You made this flight bearable." The elderly woman from earlier pressed her husband's hand against her heart, then looked at Keanu with tearful gratitude. "You were our angel up here," she said softly. Others nodded, some simply offering warm smiles. They didn't shout his name. They didn't crowd him with selfies. They honored the way he wanted to exist. Quiet, humble, unseen. Gregory watched all of it. And for the first time in years, he didn't envy the attention. He admired the respect, the kind that wasn't demanded but earned through humanity. At the gate when they disembarked, Gregory found himself walking beside Keanu through the terminal. The usual bustle of the airport surrounded them, people rushing, announcements blaring, luggage wheels rattling. Yet in the middle of it, Gregory felt a stillness. He cleared his throat. "Listen, I owe you an apology for the way I treated you when we boarded, for the things I said." Keanu stopped, looking at him with steady eyes. "You don't owe me. You owe yourself. If you see something in yourself you don't like, change it. That's the real apology." Gregory swallowed hard. His chest tightened, but not with pride this time, with humility. "I don't know if I can." Keanu placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Then start small, one kindness at a time." The final lesson, they reached the fork in the terminal where their paths would split. Keanu toward baggage claim, Gregory toward a waiting car. Gregory hesitated. "Why carry that toy car? You could buy 100 of them. Why keep an old one in your bag?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Because it reminds me that little things matter. Sometimes the smallest thing you give away is the biggest thing someone else receives." Gregory nodded slowly, his throat too tight to reply. He watched Keanu walk away, blending into the crowd, no entourage, no spotlight. Just a man with a backpack, disappearing like any other traveler. A new beginning hours later, Gregory sat in the back of his car, staring at the skyline of Manhattan as it rolled past. For the first time, the towers didn't look like symbols of conquest. They looked like places full of people, people with struggles, fears, hopes. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then made a call. When his son answered, groggy but surprised, Gregory's voice cracked. "Hey, it's Dad, I just wanted to hear your voice. And maybe we could grab dinner this week." Silence, then a cautious, "Yeah, sure. I'd like that." Gregory hung up, leaning back against the seat. His chest felt lighter than it had in decades. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. He was done living only for himself, and somewhere in the terminal behind him, a man in worn boots and a faded jacket had given him the greatest gift of all, permission to change.